Hello, everyone. We are back with another round of Turing Mock interview series. I'm Fazil from Pune, India. I am a full stack engineer at Turing, and I have 5 years of experience in working with JavaScript, React, Angular, Node, MongoDB, and blockchain. Today, I will be interviewing Marcus for the role of an experienced DevOps engineer. Are you guys excited? Let's get started. So, Marcus, how are you doing today, and how has been your day so far?
Hi, Faisal. I'm doing really nice today. Thanks for asking. And what about you? How are you
Yeah,
doing today?
it has been a superb day so far, and I'm very excited for this interview.
Cool. I'm also really excited about that.
Amazing, amazing. So, Marcus, can you tell me more about yourself and your professional experience to begin with?
For sure, I can share this with you. So, as you've already mentioned, my name is Marcos. I'm from Brazil, and I'm 33 years old. Uh, I've been working as a software engineer for around 10 years. And, at the beginning of my career, I worked as a backend engineer, front-end engineer as well.
Oh,
Most of this time using language like Java, JavaScript, and also React, Angular. However, since 2019, I start working as a DevOps engineer, and I start using other kind of language, and also other kind of technologies like Terraform, AWS, and also GCP, Google Cloud Platform.
mhm.
So that's basically about my experience and about me.
Superb. So that was great. I mean, I loved the way you introduced yourself. So, Marcus, I see that you worked so hard to be where you're today. So, can you tell me more about some of the interesting DevOps pipelines that you worked on in the past?
Yeah, for sure that I can share this with you. So let me start talking about my first experience as a DevOps engineer.
Uh-huh.
So as I mentioned, through 2019, I had the opportunity to start working on a DevOps project.
Mhm.
Basically, the company that I was working for was hired for a very important sports league in US,
Mhm.
and they hired us in order to help them to migrate their whole cloud from AWS into GCP.
Okay.
And then, in order to do that, they choose the Terraform language as the main infrastructure as code language in order to
Mhm.
do that. And it was really cool because I didn't have experience with Terraform yet. And it was nice because I had the opportunity to work with it. And I learned a lot about how to deal with GCP cloud, how to deal with AWS cloud. So it was amazing. It was a very nice experience. It was a very intensive one, because we had like 6 months to migrate their whole cloud. So then we had to do with many different resources, like we have to create Kubernetes clusters. We have to deal with Memcached
Yeah.
instances, storage and databases and all of this kind of thing. We also had to create a very well-defined VPC networks and interconnects to keep
Mhm.
both communicating to other, I mean, the GCP cloud as well as the AWS cloud.
Oh,
So it was very nice, and I've learned a lot. So that was a very nice first experience as a DevOps engineer.
wow. Your background looks amazing. And I've also checked your resume. Believe me, it's a perfect fit for this role. Okay.
Nice. That's really nice to hear that.
Yeah, moving ahead to the next question. So let's
Okay,
dive a little more deeper into DevOps. So Marcus,
cool.
I mean, if I take your opinion, what is the difference between DevOps and Agile methodology?
Okay, so I think that in order to answer that, first of all, I would like to tell you what DevOps means in my own words.
Yeah.
So as the name says, DevOps means dev, which means development, and ops, operations. So I think that DevOps, it's a culture, or I would say a way of work
Mhm.
in order to reduce the gap between the development team and the operational team.
True.
You know that before having this kind of professional, the DevOps team or the DevOps professional, we usually had a gap between the development phase and have the software in place and healthy and working fine in production environment. So what used to happen before is that the development team creates the product, implement the solution. However, once you put it to start working, we had a lot of gaps. It doesn't work as expected and so on.
True.
I think that DevOps means how we can deal with that problem, how we can help the development team to keeps developing the solution, the product, in a way that it will really work once you put that in product, and it will keeps working. Like we have a great way to keep it up and running. It will be monitored and so on. So all the DevOps stuff is about to reduce the gap between the development phase and how it really works in production. However, you have also mentioned about Agile methodology, and I think that it's a bit different. The Agile methodology, again, it's also a culture, it's also a way of work, but at this time, I think it's more on the development phase. Once the development team is developing the software, and this is more about how the development team will implement the features one over another one, how the development team will iterate and improve the solution provided. I think that it's more about how they will communicate with the clients, how they will prioritize the solution, the features that's going to be implemented. So I would say that Agile methodology, it's a bit different, and it's more about to reduce the gap between the development team and also the customers itself.
Yeah, absolutely. Very well answered, Marcus. Quite detailed, I would say.
Thank you.
So now let's move on to the next question. So Marcus,
Okay.
what are your thoughts on component-based development in DevOps?
Okay. Okay, you've mentioned component-based development in DevOps, but just to clarify, component-based development, it's something that we can use in all layers of the development phase, I would say. So for example, I've already worked as a front-end developer, and in front-end, specifically on those kind of new technologies that we've used for front-end, it's very, very component-based development. Like imagine that you're going to create a button, and that button will have a specific behavior. So then you can implement a component that it's that button with that behavior. You can share that button across multiple parts of your product. However, you can also use a already existing button with that specific behavior, and it can save you a lot of time having to implement that and test and make sure that it's going to work as expected. So we can also reuse it on other parts of our code. But now talking about DevOps stuff, we can also do something similar. Okay. I think that we're going to talk about this later on, but in the infrastructure level, infrastructure layer of our products, we can kind of create some code in order to have it done. And we can also reuse or use something that it's already implemented, tested, and verified, and just simply start using it, and it's gonna save you a lot of time, implementing, testing, and so on. And let me give you an example of that. So imagine that you have to implement a load balancer. And just to clarify, a load balancer seems like it's a one resource, but actually it's composed by a lot of other resources. Like we have to create a front end for the load balancer, a back end for the load balancer. We also have to implement a health check for the load balancer, and also the forward rules and some other stuff. So then, instead of creating all of them, try to put that together and test and validate, we can simply use a already existing module online and just reuse it. For example, nowadays I've been using GCP Cloud for our cloud provider. And if you take a look at GitHub repositories, you're going to see that there are some pre-existing solutions for load balancer in GCP. So then you can just go there, taking a look at the solution, and simply reuse. You know that GitHub is a very wide used across many developers, and every time that I have to implement something, I usually try to look for a official repository in GitHub and try to reuse, or at least see how they implement that specific resource there. So that's what I would say about CBD.
Perfect. Very well answered, Marcus. So let's move ahead to the next question. So Marcus, what do you think can be a preparatory approach for developing a project using the DevOps methodology?
Okay. In this case, I would have to ask you about what do you mean by a project in DevOps methodology? Because I think that there are two kind of ways to deal with that. There's the green field, like you're going to join a team that will start building a product from scratch, and you already have the DevOps team well defined, and you can, having a backlog, had a roadmap, and define how it's going to happen across all the development and the operational phase. You can also, validate some stuff before starting working on the project. However, that's not what used to happen. What used to happen is that you're going to join a company that already have something in place, and they want a solution fast. They already have some services in production environment. And what you have to do is, as DevOps says, reduce the gap between development phase and ops. But we already have something ready and work. So in this case, what I would say is that we should have a plan and a assessment about what we do have nowadays in terms of DevOps. What would be something that should be implemented to have a better return? What is high priority at this time? Like, we have a very big gap on monitoring stuff. And that's what happened on my current company. I joined it and they said, hey, we have a very big gap on monitoring stuff. So let's focus on this and let's try to define a plan, and let's play around with some optional solutions, and let's implement it. And then once you start, working on that kind of gaps, the idea is to keep using it and keep working using the DevOps culture. Okay, and there are a lot of things that we should keep in mind when we are using DevOps culture. Like we must having a well-defined version control. We must have a continuous integration, continuous delivery. We must have a continuous monitoring. That it's also very important because most of teams usually think about the delivery, but in what happened after the delivery. So this is something that we should always keep in mind.
Absolutely, absolutely. So you covered the whole 9 yards. So that was very well answered, I would say.
Thank you.
So Marcus, I heard you talking about Memcached while you were talking about your professional experience. So can you tell me more about Memcached and why is it important for an application?
For sure that I can talk about Memcached. Yeah, so as I've mentioned, on my first experience as a DevOps, I had to implement some instances of Memcached in GCP. And in GCP, you can have some, not only GCP, but in most of the cloud providers, you can have a kind of managed solution for Memcached, which means that the cloud provider will take care about many kind of things regarding Memcached, like the availability, how we're going to deal with backups and all of these kind of things, which saves you a lot of time. But Memcached, it means that it's a kind of tool that you can use to, and it's a kind of free memory tool that you can use to cache some data once you're using your application. And it's very good and it's very important especially when you need high performance on your application. So let me give you some examples, some use cases of cache that will make it easier for you to understand how and when we should use Memcached. So the most common use case for Memcached is when you put your cache in front of a database layer.
Yeah.
So imagine that you have an application that will give you, and you're gonna list all the products on your application. For example, you have a e-commerce application, and you want to list all the products available there. So then, once you try to grab all this information from the database, instead of going directly into the database, you can go into a cache system, and this cache system can check if your required data is already there, and if so, you won't have to go into the database. And as I've mentioned, Memcached is a free memory data caching solution. So then it will be a way faster than going to the database and grab the data.
Absolutely.
So then that's the most common use case for caching for a Memcached instance. However, you can also use this in other ways, like there is something that it's very intensive used. For example, once you have a application that have the concept of users and users profile, like what if the user is authenticated, if what's the authorizations for that user, and all of this kind of thing. The user, once it's authenticated, it will try to use it during all the time that the user is authenticated and using the application. So then it will try to access this kind of data all the time. So then in this case, it's very, very useful to use a cache system, because instead of having to get into the database all the time, you can just simply use the cache, and at the first time that the user is authenticate, you will store on cache all of its profile and its authorization stuff, and then the user can reuse it. So basically, I would say that Memcached is used once you have a kind of data that must be accessed many times during the usage of the system. And then I have one other example, like on gaming solutions. Once you have multiple users playing a kind of game, and it will have a lot of actions being done during the gaming phase or something like that.
Yeah.
So then in this case, you have to access data all the time, and then it's really recommend to use a cache instead of accessing the database all the time.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Very well answered, Marcus. And viewers, let me know in the comment section below on how you would have answered the same question differently. Okay, so Marcus, as you mentioned, that Memcached is a caching solution which can be used for authentication, gaming servers, product listings, etc., which means it is the heart of the application. And it is very important to minimize the server outages caused due to Memcached outages. So how would you minimize Memcached server outages? What are the ideas that you would like to share with us today?
Yeah, this is really important. And well, I would say that if I would implement a Memcached solution nowadays, for sure that I would looking for this kind of managed solution already provided by cloud providers, like as I've mentioned in GCP memory store, because as I've mentioned, they will try to deal with this kind of situation, which would be very nice, because in cloud providers, they have the concept of zones and regions. So if you create a kind of Memcached in a region stuff, in a region, in a specific region, they will have multiple duplications of your data across zones. So in case of one zone outage, they will be able to automatically keep the data available for you, which is really, really interesting. And that I would suggest at the first glance. However, there are some specific situations that we're not allowed to use this kind of thing and so on. And then I think that it's also depend on the use case for the Memcached. For example, there are some situations that you can define a kind of timeout for your cache. So for example, if you define a reduced timeout, in case of you reach that timeout, that means that probably your cache it's out. So then let's go directly into the database for a small time and going to there and try to do that. So that would be another option. And of course, that how you implement your code in order to deal with cache, it's also very important. If you tightly depend on the cache strategy, it might be a problem for you, and you might have a bigger timeout once you have a outage. So you always have to keep this in mind. And I would say that the last thing would be a kind of multiple instances of Memcached and define a list of servers IP once you define it there. And again, it's always recommended to have a kind of monitoring stuff, and you could have a health check for your Memcached instance. In case of outage, you have a kind of script to run and make sure that it will be back soon. So that was I would answer for this.
Perfect. Very well answered, Marcus.
Thank
And
you.
as we know that a DevOps interview is incomplete without talking about Jenkins. So Marcus, would you like to talk about the architecture of Jenkins?
Okay, let me talk about Jenkins. I've already used Jenkins some time ago. Honestly, nowadays I'm not been using Jenkins. We have some other tools that we've been using nowadays.
Mm-hmm.
But basically, Jenkins is a tool that uses the master slave approach.
Yeah.
And that means that once you have a repository, a Git code that you push some changes into the code, it will trigger the Jenkins master agent.
Mm-hmm.
And that master agent will decide which slave to ask in order to run the script. So basically, the master agent will be a kind of coordinator, and it will demand which slave must run any kind of script once the Git code requires it. And it's highly recommend to have multiple agents, because especially when you have multiple repositories, once you have multiple services, and whenever a new service push some changes, it will trigger the Jenkins will run the script, and so on.
Yeah.
And for Jenkins specifically, we can have multiple tasks that can be run there. So for example, I've already used Jenkins in order to deploy a new version of the software, which is
Mm-hmm.
the most used stuff, but
Yeah.
I've also already used it to run migration scripts. So imagine that we have a service that has a database,
Mm-hmm.
and whenever we want to deploy a new version of the database, we can have a Jenkins script to run the migrations and
Yeah.
so on. And there's also another interesting thing that I would like to share is that now Jenkins have a new tool, a new feature called Jenkins Acts that
Okay.
we can use to deploy services in a containerized way. So if you deal with Kubernetes instance and you want to deploy services in Kubernetes, you can use this new tool called Jenkins Acts in order to do this.
Okay. That's very interesting, and I didn't knew that.
Yeah.
Okay, so Marcus, moving ahead, would you like to talk about infrastructure as code in DevOps?
Yeah, for sure. I think that it's a very important thing regarding DevOps. If you want to do DevOps, you must use infrastructure as code, in my own opinion. And infrastructure as code means like when you want to use, when you want to implement code for your infrastructure. It's a pretty straightforward definition of infrastructure as code. But let me just give you some examples in order to make it clear. As I've mentioned, imagine that we want to implement load balancer. So as I've mentioned, you can define a code in order to do that. For example, if you want to deploy a cluster, Kubernetes cluster, and define a lot of services that will run into it. So all of this kind of thing you can do using infrastructure as code. And why it's so important? Because I'm sure you've already heard something like, oh, it works in development, but it doesn't work in staging, but it doesn't work in production. And that usually happens because for some reason, something is different from development environment and production environment.
True.
So for example, nowadays we have in my current company, we have a very strict rule internally to only deploy changes into prod, into staging, and into development using infrastructure as code. So then once you deploy something in dev and it's worked there, we are sure that it's going to work in prod because we're using exactly the same code. So this help us a lot to be more, confident about what's going to be deployed in prod. So it's very, very important. And we have some examples of language that we can use for infrastructure as code. And as for any kind of other programming language, we have some imperative and some declarative language. I'm gonna talk about the declarative language that I've been using, which is Terraform. It's a very common used language, and it's called declarative because you define what's gonna be created. So like I want to create a virtual machine. So there is a specific command declaration for that specific resource, and then you define it and you create it. So that's what I would say about infrastructure as code.
Super, very well answered, Marcus. So Marcus, do you want to talk about what is dogpile effect and how can it be prevented in production?
Yeah, for sure. Well, dogpile effect, it's related to caching systems and this kind of thing. So as we've discussed about Memcached previously, but let me quickly recap about how does it work and when we can reach into a kind of dogpile effect. So as I've mentioned before, Memcached or any kind of caching system uses when we want to, for some reason, put it in front of a database, for example. And once we try to grab some data, instead of going directly into the database, it goes into the cache, check if it's already there, and if not, go into the database, load the data into cache, and return the response. That's the most common usage for caching strategies. However, what might happen is that when you're dealing with a very high intense application, you can have the same request like 100 times at the same time. So in this specific case, what's going to happen is that you have 100 requests on cache. Cache will answer, no, we don't have this data. So then you should go into the database. So then all of these 100 requests will go into the database and try to grab the same data. So that's very, very undesired situation. And then this is called dogpile effect. So then in this case, once this kind of thing happen, what we should do, we should try to implement a kind of lock effect using semaphores or this kind of thing. And then what should happen is that once we have 100 requests at the same time for the same kind of data, we should, the first one that reaches the cache should kind of create a lock, and all the other ones should keep waiting for the response. So then that one that, won the race, it will go into the database, grab the data and load into cache. And then all the other ones will just using the data available in cache. So that's a way to kind of fix this kind of dogpile effect and, prevent to having a very high overload on our database. That's how dogpile effect works.
Perfect. Very well answered, Marcus.
Thank you.
Now I would like to call upon my fellow developers and viewers watching this video. If you think we've missed a question today, please post them in the comment section below. And if you're looking for a job, go to www.turing.com/jobs and apply for the one as per your expertise. All right, let's move ahead to the next question.
Okay.
So, Marcus, can you talk about how do we ensure that the script runs every time a developer pushes some code to a repository in the form of a new commit?
Okay, for sure that I can talk about this. You know that Git is a very used version control tool. It's a very nice one. And Git has a kind of feature called hooks into it.
Yeah.
And what it happened is that once we perform a action, especially in this case on Git push, the Git can trigger those hooks, will be triggered by those hooks, and you can run any kind of scripts. And then I think that it's better to talk about some use cases for this, and I can tell about how I've already used this.
Yeah.
So for example, there are some different kind of hooks that can be used on Git. And first off, one of them is the pre-received hook, which happens before really perform the push command. So this is very, very useful once you have to, for example, validate your code before pushing it up.
Yeah.
So I've already worked on a company that, they were a very big project and they had like 20 teams. So it was very crazy project. And they have a very well-defined rules when pushing some codes. Because, since they are a very big one, they need to keep that track.
Absolutely.
So then, for example, the commit message was very important. We have to follow a lot of rules when creating the commit message. And we have a pre-receive hook in order to validate that commit message. So once you try to push a commit that doesn't follow that specific rules for commit messages, it will be rejected. And there are other things that we must make sure that was okay before pushing it. Like we used to run a linked command in order to check all the rules for the development stuff and also run the unit tests. Only if the unit tests are all okay, we would be able to push the code into the branch. So that's how I've already used pre-received rook. And for post-received rook, we could also do some things. For example, nowadays I've been working on a strategy to, once we create a tag on GitHub, it will automatically trigger the Terraform command, and it will automatically apply all the resources being created into the development environment.
Wow.
So this is something that we could also do. And other than this, also run some kind of integration tests. This is also that we've been doing nowadays. There we can also work on a kind of Slack integration and send some messages into Slack like, hey, this code just merge some things into main, or this code just create a tag. So this kind of thing.
Superb. That is so amazing. So, Marcus, that was the last technical question for this interview. Now, it would be great if you could help all the DevOps enthusiasts watching this video on how could they gather more knowledge in the field of DevOps, or if someone wants to learn DevOps from scratch or migrate from a software engineer to the DevOps field the way you did, how would they be able to do it, and what are the resources that they should refer to?
Okay, so in order to answer that, I would like to quickly talk about my own experience. And I started doing this migration when I had the opportunity to study for a GCP certification. So there was a kind of a challenge internally at the company to help the developers to take GCP certifications. And I studied about GCP and I was able to pass into the GCP certifications. And that was really good because I had the opportunity to learn a lot about different features provided by GCP. And for sure that if we want to work as a DevOps engineer, I'm 100% sure that you're going to work with one of the clouds, GCP or Azure or AWS or one of them. So I think that it's very important to learn about at least one of the cloud providers. And I don't like to simply study by study. I like having a kind of goal, a kind of objective, and this kind of study for a certification helps me a lot in order to study a lot about that cloud and so on. And that's how I usually study by myself for a specific thing. And other than this, I think that you also must study a kind of infrastructure as code programming language. I would recommend Terraform since it's very common used, but we have some other ones like Chief, Ansible, and so on. So you could choose at least one of them and studying it. And other than this, I think that it's also important to learn some basic stuff like how to deal with Docker, with Jenkins, as we've just talked about Git Hubs and GitHub and how the hooks works and this kind of thing. And also Kubernetes. I think that some companies have been using Kubernetes. So if you know how that works and at least the basic stuff, what is a pod, what is a deployment, this kind of thing, it might be very useful for you to do this migration. So that's what I would suggest.
Perfect. So, all right, that's it for today, Marcus. Thank you so much for sharing such valuable information with us today.
Thank you. It was a pleasure for me.
Yeah, I should say you're such a great DevOps engineer, and it was really nice speaking to you.
Likewise.
Yeah. And to everyone else watching this video, thank you so much for tuning into this mock interview series and viewing it till the end. And I hope you've enjoyed it as much as we did today. We will be back with many more episodes covering different tech stacks and languages. So if you're looking for some specific interviews, please drop in your suggestions in the comment section below. And don't forget to give us a big fat thumbs up if you like this video. And if you want to get notified in future for such video releases, do subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell icon. You can also follow Turing on Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn, and Twitter for more frequent updates. I'll see you again in the next mock interview. Till then, take care, stay safe, and happy coding.